Welcome to Psychology Today. I'm your host, Ann Morrow. This is a show about bicycling in general and bicycle safety specifically. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to our behind-the-scenes crew who make this show possible. And of course, thank you to Northwest Bicycle Safety Council for producing Psychology Today. We'll have a video a little later in the show to entice you to come out and enjoy Northwest Bicycle Safety Council's Beaverton, Banks, and Beyond Bicycle Tour on August 23rd. Please go to our website and get signed up. It's a beautiful route with many options. Whatever your skills and abilities, we have a route for you. And if you haven't explored the Banks-Vernonia Linear Trail and Stubb Stewart State Park, this is an opportunity to be introduced to this spectacular riding area. Join us and support Northwest Bicycle Safety Council while getting a fun ride. More on that later. Our guest is Ben Tabor, who is a bicycle mechanic, but also took a cycling trip to Israel a few months ago. And I think that you'll find his experiences very interesting. So let's get started. Welcome to Psychology Today, Ben.
Hi, Ann. Thanks for having me here.
I'm glad you could make it. So I always kind of like to lay a little groundwork. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in Portland, Oregon?
Sure. Well, I came to Portland about 2 years ago, and I was actually moving cross country from Baltimore, but I was living in the DC area at the time. And that was actually a cross country bike trip to move here. So I had quite a time getting to Portland. I came here to be closer to some friends and family, and I took up a job at the bike gallery.
Wow, that's quite an experience. So how is it that you came to bicycle to Portland?
Well, it's a long, separate story, but there was a relationship I was coming back to and hopefully going to restart, and I figured Portland was going to be the spot where I was going to settle down and probably get hitched. So I figured if I wanted to ride my bike across the country, I pretty much had one shot to do it. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for that little side note.
Sure.
So, and you do work, as you said, as a mechanic at Bike Gallery. What kinds of bicycling do you like to participate in now?
Well, obviously I really enjoy long distance cycling, and bike touring is one of my favorite things to do. I've toured pretty widely. Crossing the U.S. on the southern route, partially on the Trans-America route, but partially on my own route. I enjoy just recreational road and mountain biking, and in the winter times, Portland's such a huge destination for cyclocross. I really enjoy racing cross. So,
oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I do a couple of different series. I'm not a top level rider or anything like that, but I just enjoy myself.
So it sounds like you're really into the Portland bike scene. You're in the right place.
Yeah. I need to make time in my life specifically for things not related to bikes sometimes.
And how did you, in your early life, get interested in bicycling?
Well, I was kind of a late bloomer. I didn't learn to ride until I was about 15. And at 15 that's the point I think a lot of my peers were getting their driver's license. And I had a license, but for me driving was always work because my father's a farmer. So to drive meant working. It wasn't enjoyable. It wasn't fun. And every time I got behind the wheel, I was driving a farm truck. So cycling was really my time and my escape and my independence. And once I started riding, which I got a fairly late start in doing, I really just didn't want to stop. So that was soon after, that was my first kind of unsuccessful bike camping trip. And then I've sort of built on that since then.
Now, you traveled to Israel to bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you choose that destination?
Well, I had a number of opportunities growing up to go to Israel, but the opportunities that were presented to me, I'm Jewish, inside of the Jewish community, were always ones that would be very heavily structured. So would be trips. There was a trip available through the school I went to and through different religious institutions and congregations and youth groups. But from learning about these trips, it was always understood that you would have zero time to yourself, and that the guides would pick and choose every destination, and before you could really even get to know a place, in my mind, you'd be sort of whisked away to the next place. So I really wanted to do things on my terms. I'm kind of stubborn like that, And it frankly has taken me this long to save up enough money to do it. So it was it involved taking a bunch of time off from work and then the plane tickets and financing the rest of the trip.
Right.
So yeah, I guess comparatively, riding your bike across the country really doesn't need to cost hardly anything. But taking a plane trip to Israel is fairly expensive.
Yes, yes. But and so, what kind of planning and research did you do for this trip?
Well, I have some family in Israel. Growing up inside the Jewish community, you're sort of surrounded by information, especially in Baltimore, where there's a huge Jewish community. You're sort of surrounded by information day to day about Israel, and I hear things from my family, and of course I read newspapers and watch the news. But it's a very different picture that's presented mostly in the U.S. about things going on in Israel and also in Palestine and the Arab neighbors of Israel. So the press that I was trying to keep up with was actually Israeli newspapers in advance to try to get an understanding of what the trip would be like and what would be going on around me while I was there. But also international press, so checking the BBC and Al Jazeera. Doing that kind of research really helped me kind of know what I was walking into. But at the same time, what's in the headlines really isn't what's going on in everybody's day-to-day life. So those two things could be very separate often.
So was it kind of countered to them by input from your family that lived in Israel?
Yeah, definitely.
They were more a grounding?
Yeah, definitely. But Israelis, part of my trip was definitely going to be visiting Palestine, and Israelis, for the most part, are prohibited from going into the West Bank. There are areas inside of the West Bank that are settled by Israelis, and there's Israeli and Jewish settlements inside the West Bank. But for the most part, Israelis couldn't move freely into the West Bank and visit Palestinian towns and cities. It would be illegal. And the same is true very much more so for Palestinians. They can't move across borders easily and visit Israeli towns and cities. So what I was doing was very unique to the people who were really neighbors to each other.
I see.
And have been cut off from each other for a long while now. So if anything, Israelis and Palestinians were both asking me about what's going on with their neighbors just on the other side of a wall or a next town over, because while they may have had connections in the past, those have been severed by the physical separations between Israel and Palestine.
And some of your planning had to do with the bicycle. I mean, it wasn't a traditional trip that you could in that regard, because you were taking your bicycle and you were going to ride your bike. How did you plan for that element of it?
Well, drawing on the bike touring I'd done before, everything that I need to do in terms of knowing how much food and water I need to carry and have all my camping gear prepared, all that stuff was very familiar to me. And if anything, that was sort of the way to recollect myself after being in unfamiliar surroundings all day, was that being in my tent or being around my bike or being on my bike, it feels very familiar whether you're riding, in your morning commute away from your house or whether you're in a foreign country. So for me, that was always like a grounding point for me.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there wasn't much I had to do in that regard. I don't speak very much Hebrew. I speak a little bit of Hebrew, and I picked up a little bit of Arabic. Certainly learning the language is really going to make your time in Israel and Palestine much easier. But English is spoken pretty widely. So, I think aside from the logistics of getting to the point where I could save enough money to get on a plane, it wasn't all that difficult actually while I was there. But yeah, I would say the most challenging thing is asking locals for directions, because Israelis and Palestinians are both, I would say, united by a similar characteristic of giving terrible directions. So if there was some element of a peace process that could take place around shared inability to give proper directions, then we would really be much further down the line.
That's interesting. Now, as you prepared, what kind of safety factors did you consider? Because any trip, whether it's across the U.S. or anywhere, you're thinking about traffic and safety. Was that any consideration, or?
Well, I want to encourage people to be adventurous and to take the kind of risks that really will get you to places where you wouldn't otherwise get to go on a tour bus. But at the same time, people should know that Israeli drivers have they have the worst reputation in the world in terms of being dangerous drivers. So the street rules are very different. It's actually legal in a lot of places in Israel for drivers to drive directly onto a sidewalk, which if you're not familiar with it, can be really startling if you're just a pedestrian. But if you're a cyclist, it's extra crazy because you would imagine that you have this buffer area between the sidewalk and the shoulder of a road, and that area is yours, and drivers won't enter that area. But in Israel, drivers own that part of the road as well, right onto the sidewalk, sometimes right up to storefronts or front steps. So, yeah, that's a little startling. The roads are much narrower in a lot of places in the country where you're going through ancient towns and cities. We're talking about places designed around horse carts or donkey travel or camels, not even cars. So I guess it's similar to European cities where the streets are very narrow.
So that was the big safety thing, is the auto traffic.
I think so. I was preparing myself for more scrutiny in terms of security. So crossing back and forth between Israel and Palestine, I assumed was going to be a much more involved process where I would be searched or my things would be gone through or I would just be interrogated. And with only a few exceptions, that really just wasn't the case. Yeah, having an American passport and traveling through Israel and Palestine is actually fairly easy, regardless of what people may tell you, because Israelis still believe the same restrictions that apply to them would also include Americans as well.
Sure.
But that's actually not the case.
So, and we'll cover that a little bit more, how that all went.
Yeah, and I should say too, in terms of safety, street crime in both Israel and Palestine is extraordinarily low. I don't have any figures for you, but there are plenty more dangerous places you could go that are much closer to the United States in terms of just getting robbed on the street, even within the U.S. So theft and just kind of petty crime on the street, not a major concern for me in Israel, and it wasn't really in Palestine either. So it was more a question of how do you navigate moving in between areas that are secured by military, police, or soldiers.
Right. Now, what did your family think about this adventure of yours?
Well, they're very excited.
Oh, they were?
They were excited. I was prepared for them to give me the nth degree about how I shouldn't go and how dangerous it was, or to go with a lot of restrictions. But I think they're already used to me kind of striking out on my own, having spent 6 months riding across the U.S. and traveling all around. I think they know that they might be kind of wasting their breath if they do too much doomsaying. So they were actually also really interested in the experience I was having, and they were following pretty closely with what was going on.
Well, that's good. And so you took your own bicycle with you. How did you do that?
Well, I have a bike made by Surly, and the frame detaches with couplers at 2 points on the frame. So I bought the bike specifically for the purpose of being able to travel with it without paying extra fees through the airlines. So I wanted to pack as lightly as possible, and I wanted to carry one carry-on bag if I could, which was like a light hiking backpack. And then everything else that I needed to carry with me for my camping trip, I could fit within the airline luggage regulation size box that the Surly cross-check would break down into. So any bike can be fitted with these couplers with only a few exceptions, and it makes airline travel so much easier. They ended up charging me about $20 extra on top of just the standard plane ticket because of I was over in weight. But the size of the box was still within airline regulations.
Because a traditional bike box is pretty big, and I think, it's pretty, I don't know what the cost is, but maybe over $100.
Yeah, the fees could vary. I was looking into it through the different airlines I was buying tickets from. The fees could vary pretty widely, but yeah, more than $100 easily.
So you had it all down to a science in that regard so that you could go as cheaply as possible.
That's right. That's right. And it's a useful tool to have. and it does take a little bit of technical expertise to be able to then reassemble your bike. So, and I think bike shops, if you found a bike shop in Israel, there are kind of expert level bike shops, but they may still be somewhat unfamiliar with that technology because it's not so widespread. It's still sort of a custom kind of high-end option, but definitely something that people who want to travel internationally should look into if they already have a bike they're really comfortable with.
And what time of year did you take your trip?
Well, I took my trip in the middle of the winter, and it's not the ideal time to go to Israel because parts of Israel are temperate, and depending on the elevation, there can be a rainy season that is in the center of their winter, and the rainy season could last a few weeks or it could last a few months. And it's the one time a year when there's a lot of precipitation in that part of the world. So the reason I had to take that time off is because working in the bike industry, it's just not possible for me to excuse myself during spring and summer. It wouldn't give me any job security to walk away from my work in the busiest time of bike season. So wintertime, though, it's easy for me to get some time off. So that's why I chose that time.
Okay. And we're going to take a quick break then and watch a video about Beaverton, Banks and Beyond Bicycle Tour. And then we'll be back with Ben Tabor and learn more about this trip to Israel. We're actually going to get to Israel. So let's watch a quick video. Well, that's some great footage from our Beaverton Banks and Beyond bicycle tour. And it's a great route, as you can see, great for bicycling and a lot of people having a good time. And you can be one of those people. Just get signed up August 23rd. And we're back now with Ben Tabor, and he's telling us about his bicycling trip in Israel. And I'm going to ask, we're now into Israel. We're there. And where did you start your journey, and how did you get there from the airport?
Well, I started in Tel Aviv. The Ben Gurion Airport's the only functioning airport in Israel that's like the big public airport. There used to be another airport north of Jerusalem, but that's shut down now. So all travel, basically, international travel, comes to Ben Gurion. From there, there's buses and trains that'll take you to surrounding cities. You're sort of outside of the Tel Aviv area, and I had family in Tel Aviv that was putting me up so I could use their area as kind of a staging point. And that's also where I ditched the box that my bike was in.
Mm-hmm.
So they were really great about just being able to let me leave my stuff. And the first part of my trip actually was involved some hiking that was separate from the bike trip. So I left my bike in Tel Aviv and then came back to it once I was ready to start riding.
So you did plan a pretty extensive trip. Some of it was bicycling, but some of it involved visiting with family and doing other things.
There was a huge itinerary of family, and if any of my family is watching, I'm sorry I didn't get to come to everybody's house, so yeah.
Well, why don't you tell us a brief summary about your travels, and then we'll kind of go through some of the specifics. But, you know, what was your general bicycling itinerary?
Sure. Well, I started in Tel Aviv and cycled into Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem, I was going to be going into Bethlehem, which crosses the line separating Israel and Palestine. So the Bethlehem's probably the biggest destination for international travelers who are Christian pilgrims, for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really heavily touristed area. There's beautiful churches, and then a lot of Arab Christian culture built up around the Christian holy sites all through the West Bank. So I was starting there. I was going to go north into Ramallah, and then from Ramallah north to Nablus, and then back down to Jericho, and from Jericho down along the Dead Sea, and from the Dead Sea south into the Negev, the Israeli desert. And from that point, I was going to go all the way to the bottom of the country and then come back up to Eilat and make my end destination in Tel Aviv, make a big loop.
Mm-hmm.
But it happened such that the weather really wasn't working in my favor. I had had some delays in the trip, so I had to change my route pretty considerably. And being in the middle of the rainy season, I had heard some warnings about pretty massive flooding that was going on all over the country, or that could be going on all over the country, but there was no warning really, and the weather reports weren't really that accurate about flood conditions. So I found out along the way how floodwater would actually modify my bike trip.
Well, and that, based on what you said earlier about the bad directions, that doesn't sound like a good situation, that you've got to modify your trip and you don't really know the area, so you've got to rely, I presume, on the locals to tell you how to get to where you want to be on a bicycle.
The good news with a place like Israel is that there's really just not that many roads. So it's hard to get lost if you're used to navigating in the United States, where you're looking at an interconnecting system of highways and interstates and then country roads. There's really only a few roads that connect major population areas. In fact, in the southern part of Israel, there's really only 3 or 4 roads that connect north and south.
I see.
So the conditions are pretty well known about how those roads are. There's no real great opportunity to get lost. The only roads that sort of meander off to nowhere are gravel or dirt roads that you might see caravans using. But it wouldn't be something you'd take on a car trip or on a road bike. You'd have to have a mountain bike or a off-road vehicle.
Well, that helped eliminate some problems.
Yeah, it's the roads made enough sense that oftentimes I didn't actually have to ask for directions. So that's helpful, knowing what I did about terrible directions. People just wanted to help, even if they didn't know what I was asking.
Yeah.
And so they would try their best to be totally helpful, even if they didn't really know what I was asking them for.
I think we're sometimes guilty of that here too.
Sure, yeah.
Now, one day of travel, you were near some fighter jets testing and stuff. Tell us about that situation.
Yeah, it was. I'd say it was one of the things I didn't know going in, and it was one of the things that my research really didn't tell me. But I was sort of aiming to find my way into Israel's national park system, and it's pretty widespread. And there's major trails that connect north and south the entire country. With hiking routes and off-road mountain biking and camel travel. You could traverse the entire country off-road, essentially. But what I didn't realize was that the military uses those same national park areas as proving grounds and testing areas. So it wasn't until I was actually in some of these places where I would see signs that were warning about live ammunition or open firing or tank travel, or mortar fire, or mines. And it's just not something you'd really be prepared for if you had gone through a national park system here in the United States.
Right.
The military has their own place, but as it is in such a tiny country, the military only has so much room to play before they'd actually be crossing their own borders and potentially declaring war on another country. So yeah, they share national park space with military proving grounds, and it's kind of a shock for me to have been so close to bombs dropping or things being destroyed by missiles. They're pretty nonchalant about it too. I mean, you'd maybe only be a quarter mile away from the road where you'd see missiles launched to destroy buildings that were used for target practice. So I did get to see some of that. I'd never seen rocket fire that close before.
No, no. That sounds really interesting and probably frightening.
It breaks some of the silence of the desert.
Yeah, I guess so. Now you traveled light, as you described, just with a backpack essentially, and so you had just some specific clothing that would serve a lot of purposes.
Yeah.
And you found that your clothing inadvertently assisted you in a lot of ways. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it did. I had I had bike panniers and I had a front handlebar bag, but all that stuff was packed in. I could pack all that into the contents of a backpack, so it was pretty compact. But the wintertime weather was chilly enough that I wore a sweater that I took with me, which was a long sleeve wool black sweater with a high collar. And when I buttoned that sweater all the way up, what I found out later was that people mistook me for a priest traveling by bicycle. And I didn't understand that until I was actually in Palestine going through some Palestinian Christian towns in the north. And it was at that point I was stopping at some churches to do some sightseeing and take some pictures. And the nun who was attending the Catholic church I was visiting called me Padre. And I didn't understand. I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding with language. She did speak some English, so I didn't know exactly what she was saying. It wasn't until much later that somebody told me that they just sort of assumed I was a priest, somebody with a lot more English that I met later in the road, down the road. So being mistaken for a priest in an area where there's animosity between Arabs and Jews and Palestinians and Israelis puts you in sort of a neutral place. And priests travel throughout Israel and Palestine visiting Christian holy sites. So to be on a bicycle just didn't seem that odd, given that people thought I was maybe a priest or missionary.
Yeah, that sounds really, and that you were just kind of oblivious to that.
I didn't realize it until
first.
much later. But once I did realize it, I totally milked it.
I bet.
Because I really did want to see destinations. I didn't want to engage with soldiers or military people. That wasn't the point of my trip. So if this was going to make it easier to go to certain sites, I completely took advantage of this confusion. And I really didn't have any other clothes to wear anyway.
Right,
so
right.
it wasn't really an option of just putting on something else.
Cute. Now, how did you find the general infrastructure for cycling? You talked about it a little bit. And some of your photos that I saw there was some wide shoulders on roads that looked pretty safe and comfortable.
Yeah, Israelis are very outdoorsy, very athletic people. Cycling's very popular in Israel, and the big Israeli cities and towns have bike share programs. So people rent bikes to get around, they own bikes, or they use the municipal bike share, which means there's a lot of bikes on the roads in Israeli cities. So that was great to see. I was never really alone when I was riding in cities. There were tons of other cyclists. The areas connecting cities, there are a number of routes for road cyclists that would be popular routes to go from, let's say, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or Tel Aviv to Haifa in the north. Those are points in which Israelis and foreign tourists, they're destinations for road cyclists, but they're not that widespread. There's much more infrastructure actually built up around mountain biking in Israel.
Oh, okay.
So there's mountain bike trails that you could take between really the entirety of the country, north to south, east to west. There's trails that would make areas that would otherwise be really inaccessible totally easy to get to if you're willing to mountain bike and you have a mountain bike. So yeah, I would recommend it highly for anybody that's interested in going, either finding a mountain bike or bringing your own with you, because you'll be able to visit places that otherwise could be really difficult to get to in a car or on a touring bike like I was riding.
Now, you talked about the drivers in Israel. Did you have problems out on the highways, or was it more just a city problem?
It was more of a city problem. People on the highways, they have to get places. People didn't hassle me. I didn't have any problems on the major roads or the small kind of rural roads in Israel. Yeah, I couldn't say I really had any issues with that, but there were some places where just the road was just too narrow, or later on in my trip in Palestine where I was at higher elevation and there was a lot of snow, and I was riding on roads that had just hardly been opened up. As you can imagine, there really aren't that many snowplows in Israel or in the West Bank. So people were driving on roads and streets that were totally snow covered, and they definitely weren't expecting to see a cyclist trying to make their way through the same roads clogged with snow.
Right. Now, what was your longest cycling day?
Well, I'd say the longest I rode in one day was about 80 miles, coming out from the Dead Sea up to a city called Arad, where I was visiting some friends. It was a long stretch along the Dead Sea. The days were getting pretty short. I was riding into the dark, and I would have preferred not having taken such a long day. And really, there's so much to see, and everything's packed in so close. It's really not necessary to really pile on the miles in Israel. You're going to miss all kinds of things if you just go for endurance cycling. I wouldn't make Israel or Palestine a destination for long distance cycling. I would say go to the Southwest United States, where you really have to ride 100 miles in a day just to get from one place to get water to the next. But that's definitely not the case. Even thinking about like the big expanse of the desert, sort of that's described in the Bible, it's really just not that big on a bike. You're never within 15 miles of another place where you can get food and water. So it's just not that remote out there.
Okay, and that makes sense. And tell us about the variety of the scenery that you saw. You know, you've talked about Tel Aviv, the big city, desert, the Dead Sea.
Yeah, there's ultra-modern cities in Israel and in Palestine. So Tel Aviv would be kind of mirrored by Ramallah, which is, you know, in certain places you could go and just not really know whether you're an Israeli or a Palestinian town, because they have all the same amenities. It's super modern. Everybody's on cell phones and nice cars and nice homes. And then there's other places in Israel and Palestine where you're going back to biblical times. I mean, it's very cliched to say that, but it's true. People live in a lot of places very ancient lifestyles. And there's definitely towns and cities that just haven't changed that much since the time of Jesus. I don't know if it's purposeful or not. In some ways, if we had huge tourist destinations in the United States, like the birthplace of Jesus, you would think that the place would just be built up hugely.
Like Disneyland.
Like Disneyland, exactly. But that's rarely, I found that to be rarely the case in the West Bank. And there are definitely places in Israel where you can find like a amusement park type experience around historical sites. Certainly Jerusalem and Herod's Castle is kind of, Herod's Castle on the coast is kind of a Disneyland type place.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you're also seeing places that just really haven't changed all that much over thousands of years. So
that must have been really, I don't know, quite a culture shock in a way.
Yeah, and I would say too, I mean, there's a huge range of diversity in Israel over the geography. In higher elevation areas, you have temperate forests and you know, forested areas that are obviously not like northwest conifer forests, but beautiful forested areas. And then you have really just sparse, also equally beautiful stark desert that's just spectacular. I visited a place called the Maktesh craters, which is like the equivalent of the Israeli Grand Canyon.
Oh.
And they're giant sinkholes, and I camped out there. So they're really, it's a beautiful place to be. I definitely recommend visiting the Maktesh craters in the southern portion of Israel.
Now you said that because of that shirt, you were by some people perhaps at times perceived as a priest.
Yes.
But some of the time you weren't wearing that sweater probably, and you were an American tourist. How were you received?
Well, I would say in general, very well. I had very few problems. I think in Israel, because tourism is such a huge part of the culture, of the economy, the history, Israelis sometimes can be somewhat jaded towards tourists, and tourism is sort of broken down along two lines, at least in the experience I had. There's Jewish tourists who are coming from parts all around the world, including the United States in the largest numbers. And then there's everyone else. And there's certainly no lack of holy sites and holy destinations for Jews and Muslims and Arabs, and also other faiths like the Baha'i people who have their spiritual center in Haifa, and the people I met, the Black Hebrews, who have a spiritual home in Dimona. There's also the Bedouin people and the Druze in the north, who have their spiritual centers at different points within Israel and the West Bank. So there's a lot of tourism, but to Israelis, it really breaks down in a large part of whether or not you're Jewish, because that's the way in which they're going to frame the experiences, is how relevant Jewish holy sites would be to you. Because of the way I was traveling and the way I was dressed and some of the confusion maybe around being a priest, very few Israelis assumed I was Jewish or even asked me if I was Jewish. And in that way, they kind of left me to my own devices, excepting my family, which were absolutely, totally gracious and happy to have me. So Europeans come to Israel and have a very different experience than Americans do normally, because Israelis assume Americans want the most lavish, high-end tourist experience, fancy hotels, high-end restaurants, nightclubs, limo tours, that kind of thing. And Europeans come much more ready for adventure to Israel and to Palestine. So I was sort of, by default, by the way I was dressed and the places I was going, I was sort of grouped in as a European tourist or a priest. So.
But in a way, that was what you were looking for.
It's definitely what I was looking for.
It did make it very independent and not a tourism type experience.
No, it wasn't a tour bus experience that I had, and that's really what I wanted.
Yeah.
So at other points, I was mistaken for being German, and I would have other German tourists who were more sort of adventuresome in what they were doing or where they were going, approach me and just start speaking German to me, which was interesting too. So, but people liked seeing Americans who. They liked meeting me and finding out that not all Americans want the luxury experience in Israel. They're Americans that are more interested in kind of roughing it.
Yeah.
But I would say it's less common.
Sure. Now, we talked about the fighter jets and that, that would be kind of a shock. Were you ever scared or afraid, or did you have that sense at all?
Yeah, there were a few times where I was scared. Camping in the Maktesh crater area, I was still within that national park area where there's military drills that were going on, but it had been totally silent for the time that I had set up camp and was making myself dinner and getting settled in. But in the middle of the night, they started bombing again, and so I was actually recording a little bit of an audio journal, and just as I said, I was just saying that I'd gone through these areas where there was bombing happening, and then it started up again. I didn't think they were going to drop bombs on me. I mean, I wasn't a target, and they certainly weren't going to deface the crater areas, which are kind of national treasures.
Sure.
But it was pretty close by.
Yeah.
And I would say the first time that I had to make a crossing through an Israeli security checkpoint into the West Bank, I was scared because I didn't know how it'd be received.
Yeah.
And I was totally prepared to be taken apart completely, both physically, but also interrogated by soldiers, because that's how I'd been prepared that that would happen. But it was actually underwhelming in my case, because they either mistook me for a priest or a European tourist or a Christian pilgrim. I was just sort of waved through most places. Israeli soldiers at the checkpoints are the youngest members of the Israeli military, generally, like teenagers. And most of them have smartphones, and they couldn't be bothered to get off their iPhones and ask me questions or harass me. Only once or twice did I have people kind of accost me or give me a hard time. So I got very comfortable very quickly with making those crossings.
Yeah, I bet. I've seen people have a harder time getting from Canada back into the United States than what you're describing.
It's a different security culture. People talk about this pretty widely, that you're profiled almost immediately. So me being white and ostensibly European in the eyes of soldiers, and then once I could present an American passport, which they would always ask for, The questions just really didn't go all that far because they didn't see me as a threat. Whereas in the United States, in order to be fair about it, I think border security and TSA, they want to equally scrutinize everybody.
Yeah.
To just make it fair, I suppose. So it's definitely not the case in Israel. If I looked different, or I'd come from a different place, or I was a different person, I think my experience could have been totally different and possibly awful making some of these crossings.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of things going for me.
Apparently. Now, you had a lot of good experiences with the local people. Tell us about some of the hospitality that you received and some of the good encounters you had.
Well, it's definitely true that hospitality is part of the culture and very highly valued in both Middle Eastern culture in general, in Jewish culture, and in Palestinian culture. So everywhere I went, people were curious and they wanted to take me in, and I really just had a very easy time just making small talk with people and being invited into their homes. If anything, there were some destinations that I'd set up, some timeline things that I'd set up where I wanted to be in a certain place at a certain time. And had I gone along with every invitation I got, I probably wouldn't have left certain places. And that was especially true when I was in the West Bank. I was in a fairly remote rural area, and I saw a family, an old man, a little kid who maybe was no more than 6 or 7 years old, and then a guy my age trying to clutch start a tractor that was stalled out. So they were pushing this tractor, and I could tell that they were really struggling with it, and they weren't getting it hardly anywhere because the tractor was sort of stuck in this rut. So as I'm riding my bike by on the side of the road, they're shouting sort of towards me that they need help in so many words. So I still don't understand enough Arabic to know exactly what they were saying. So I got off my bike and I jumped in and I pushed, and we got it started enough, and the clutch start happened and it kind of popped into gear and the engine started up, and then the tractor's driving. And it was only after that point that the farmer, the guy my age, had kind of looked over at me with this sort of astonishment, like, well, who are you? What are you doing here? What are you doing? And then to see my bicycle, it even just seemed even more strange. So there was a lot of explanation that I could have given and that I should have given had I spoken Arabic. But the hospitality was totally evident. They wanted me to come in and to eat with them and to drink with them, and tea is definitely something that you're offered everywhere you go. Yeah, I had a tight timeline and I didn't take them up on it, but at different points I did. So I'd been taken into people's homes throughout the trip.
It sounds like you could practically still be there, socializing with people.
Yeah, and the inclination was strong to stay, and the invitation was pretty widespread, both in Israel and in Palestine. People had a lot to say about the benefits of where they were and how beautiful their home was, and how wonderful the people were. So yeah, that was definitely the case.
What was your favorite day of bicycle riding?
Oh, my favorite day of riding, I'd say it was sort of a toss-up between being in the south in the desert and finally reaching a point where there was just sort of this incredible silence in the desert, and it's not stark and barren in the way that people might imagine, in that there's really multicolored rock and sand. There is a lot of low kind of desert shrubs and nothing like cacti, but riding across the plains of Sodom, the salt plains that are in the southern part of the Dead Sea, and making that crossing into the desert was just one of the most spectacular days of the ride, and barren but incredibly beautiful. That day, and then the day I took riding from Dimona into Hebron. That was wonderful, memorable, and maybe a little bit scary, but definitely one of the highlights of the trip.
Now, you camped, and you mentioned that. Did you camp when you were bicycling almost every night? I know you stayed with family some of the time too. And how did you know where to camp? Because even here in the United States, you can't just pitch tent anywhere
Yeah, it's
you
true.
are.
It's true. And maybe in my younger days, I might have been more adventurous, at least in the United States, and just found a spot to put down. But experience has taught me that it's really best to know where it is you're going to be and to know that it's going to be okay wherever you are. But once again, in their enthusiasm to be welcoming, there was a lot of assurances I got from local people or people in the area, even people who seemed like they would have known what they were doing, like soldiers or police, that insisting that such and such a place would be a perfect place to camp, and it was fine. And at least on 2 occasions, after getting all set up and getting settled into camp, I got woken up by soldiers in the middle of the night.
No.
So Israeli soldiers found me at my campsite and wanted me to pack up, and I told them I didn't know really where else I could go. And in the United States, that's a legitimate thing to say, because it would be dangerous to get back on the road in the middle of the night if all you have is a bike. So the suggestion that the soldier gave me was that I would go back to the main road, and I would wait at the bus stop, and then a bus would take me to Jerusalem. And I said, there's no way I'm turning back to Jerusalem. I've come this far. I'm not going back to Jerusalem. So I'm going south to Eilat. And finally they told me that if I went further down the road, I could find an area off of a beach area that I'd been camping at, and then it was fine after that.
Now, cuisine is a big part of travel. Tell us about some of the yummy stuff that you ate over in Israel.
That area of the world is hugely productive in terms of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River Valley connecting the Sea of Galilee, and Israel and Palestine have fed off of the fresh water in the Sea of Galilee and created just a huge breadbasket of agriculture. And I found, just in the most simple way, that produce, fruits and vegetables that I was already familiar with, like eggplant and cucumbers and strawberries and even onions, just tasted so much better there than some of the things I'm used to here, at least the things you could buy in a grocery store. There's something about the soil or the mineral content or the acidity of the soil, things like eggplant that I love, but I know to be very bitter, just didn't taste that way in Israel. So I could go into any market in any city or town and just pick things up that I know I liked and be in for a treat. Certainly you can go to any restaurant and people, even home-cooked meals, are going to take on a really delicious, kind of reach a level of really delicious cuisine. But I would say, for me, I like to cook my own food when I'm camping, and I could just buy raw ingredients that were just so incredibly delicious. But a favorite of mine was pita za'atar, which I would eat wherever I got the chance. And it's very simple. It's pita and olive oil, and then this coating of this crust of za'atar, which is a spice that's sort of indigenous to that area. It's in the oregano family, and it's mixed up with sesame seeds and some pepper and salt. And it has to be one of the most memorable flavors of the trip. That and cloves and cardamom, which they sneak into everything there.
Okay.
So yeah, coffee, hummus, falafel, any kind of meat that's roasting, they're going to use cloves and cardamom and cinnamon, and it definitely is, the memory of my trip is that mixture of flavors.
Well, we're going to have just a real quick video here about bicycle safety, and then we'll conclude this conversation with Ben Tabor and his trip to Israel.
Bike safe, bike smart. Hi, my name is Xander.
And my name's Elizabeth.
Over the next few minutes, we're going to have some fun and talk about some pretty important stuff.
Some of it you've heard before, but it never hurts to hear it again.
And again.
And again. So here we go. Did you know that just falling off your bike is enough to get a serious brain injury? So play it safe. Wear your helmet every time you ride. It can reduce the risk of head injury by up to 85%.
And that's a lot. The helmet should be snug on your head and sit flat. The strap should form a V under your ear, and the chin strap should also be snug. 2 fingers should fit in between your eyebrow and your helmet.
Also, make sure your helmet meets safety standards. Look for a sticker that says CPSC. This stands for the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
All the stuff we talked about today is common sense.
But you still need to think. Be courteous and be predictable by always riding in a straight line.
Wear a helmet. And follow the rules of the road. Ride with traffic on the right side of the road. Ride single file.
Obey traffic lights and traffic signs. Check behind you before turning. Use proper hand signals.
Stop, look left, right, then left again before entering a street. And use caution at an intersection.
Make eye contact with other drivers. Be careful around parked cars and watch for objects in your path.
And at night, be seen to be safe.
Never assume that motorists or pedestrians will see you. Remember, bikes are smaller than cars, and if there's a crash between the two, any guesses who will win?
That's all the time we have. So remember these 4 words. Bike safe, bike smart.
Cyclists, so I hope that you learned something from that safety video. We're back now with the conclusion of our conversation with Ben Tabor, and he's telling us about his adventures in Israel with a bicycle. And Ben, we kind of focused on the bicycling, but you had a lot of good experiences. So we talked about a best day bicycling. What about a really special day that you had just as a tourist?
Yeah, I'd say that would be my visit to Hebron. Hebron's a unique place in that it's the only city in the West Bank inside of Palestine that both is inhabited by Jews and Muslims, or Israelis and Arabs and Palestinians. But there's a holy site, which is the Tomb of the Patriarchs. It's the shrine that is erected towards the tomb site of Abraham, Sarah, and Leah, and Jacob. But it's holy to Christians and Jews and Muslims, and it's a unique place in that there's an Israeli settlement that's set up directly in the center of downtown Hebron. It's a tense place because there's a lot of security. The areas are separated, and oddly enough, they've just decided to split the shrine in half. So it's a very odd experience to be in a place where there's a mosque and a synagogue that are literally sharing the same building. It's not necessarily a harmonious existence, but if you're a tourist and you're visiting, one of the first questions that you're asked is, are you a Jew or are you a Muslim? And if you say you're a Christian, you can visit both sides, but otherwise you'd be prohibited from going from one side to the other. So sort of riding my recognition as being mistaken for being a priest, I could go to both sides, and it was really a pretty amazing experience. It's a point of conflict that is very open, it's very raw. You definitely feel it while you're there. If you talk to people, both Israelis and Palestinians there, you're going to get very different stories about who's there and why they're there and what claim they have to this place. But if you're interested in finding out about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, Hebron is really the place to visit. I was lucky enough to have met a local young guy who's a guide, and he took me into his home, and we stayed together for 2 nights and 3 days, and he took me around Hebron for a very unique tour a very special place. So yeah, get in contact with me if you are ever looking for a tour guide in Hebron.
Yeah, and that sounds, how lucky for you to have such a personal experience.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, the experience that you might have would be very much about why you couldn't be in one place or why you shouldn't be in one place or another. But instead, I got an experience that was sort of all access. So.
Well, just quickly, because we're just about out of time, just quickly, what encouragement would you give others that are contemplating a trip to Israel with their bicycle?
Well, I definitely would say if you have the ability to and you have the interest to, go with a mountain bike. And even if you're interested in camping and sort of roughing it, you can still do that and have access to the whole trail network that crisscrosses the entire country, including the West Bank, interestingly. If you're not interested in that, there are places where you can rent bikes in Israel. If you do bring your own bike and you don't want to rough it, there's certainly accommodations wherever you go. It's a country that's really built around a lot of tourism, so you're never really far from amenities, even at the highest level. If you want the most luxury experience, you can find that easily. Sometimes the most challenging thing is just finding a spot that's inexpensive, something that's more geared towards locals, because people will steer you away from those kinds of options.
Mm-hmm. So you can kind of make it what you want, as you did.
Absolutely.
Because you really mixed it up.
Absolutely. And if you can go with any knowledge, even basic knowledge of Hebrew and Arabic, it's going to make your time there that much more fulfilling.
Well, thank you, Ben, for coming and sharing your adventure. I mean, what a unique experience, and how fortunate you were to do that. And good for you for hanging in there and making the trip the one you wanted.
Well, yeah, I think it was worth the wait.
Apparently so. Thank you again.
Thanks, Ann, for having me.
So I just want to encourage you all to sign up for Beaverton Banks and Beyond. We saw that video earlier in our show. It's that time of the year. This is an event that we use to raise money for Northwest Bicycle Safety Council. And as the video showed, we really promote wearing a helmet when you ride a bike. And we use the money that we raise from the event, Beaverton Banks and Beyond, to purchase helmets and make sure that the kids in our community have a helmet. So thank you for joining us, and ride safely and obey the laws.